You may want to grow a beard if you have an Good morning, friends! For the first time on video, I'm going to review the academic evidence on the subject of facial hair and beards. In particular, how your facial hair affects your attractiveness to women and the masculinity you project both to women and to men. But before I do, please subscribe to the channel if you're not already, like the video, and comment on the video to help the channel. Now let's get started. First, I want to introduce you guys to a paradox. It's called the masculinity paradox. In general, academics love paradoxes. For example, you probably heard of the French paradox. That describes the fact that French people eat a lot of saturated fat, mainly in the form of cheese. And despite their eating so much fat, they have a lower incidence of cardiovascular disease than nutritionists and academics would have thought originally. In fact, there are other paradoxes just in the world of nutrition. The opposite of the French paradox is the Israeli paradox. In Israel, Israelis eat an unusually low amount of saturated fat but have a high incidence of cardiovascular disease. Then there are other paradoxes that regard health. For example, there's a Hispanic, or sometimes called a Mexican paradox. Mexican immigrants, originally, it's not so clear anymore, but originally Hispanic and particularly Mexican immigrants had much higher birth weights than people would think, despite their socioeconomic status. So compared to other people with similar socioeconomic statuses, their birth weights of their children were much higher, which is, by the way, a very good proxy for the health of the baby. And there's also Peto's paradox, which describes the observation that some unusually large animals do not have the enhanced cancer rates that biologists would assume. You see, biologists assume that as an organism gets larger, both due to the effects of growth factors as well as the effects of having more cells. As they have more cells, those cells could mutate, have more potential to mutate. So statistically, you would think that as an organism gets larger, it should have an enhanced cancer rate. But this is not true for some, like whales, that don't have enhanced cancer rates as we would normally assume. Anyway, the masculinity paradox regards facial hair. It was named so by Barnaby Dixon, one of the leading researchers on the subject of facial hair. In fact, he has a fascinating set of papers from the last decade or so that we're going to review almost completely in this video. The masculinity paradox describes the observation that women are more attracted to more masculine features for short-term relationships, whereas for long-term relationships, they seem to have a preference or an unusually increased interest in men that have beards. Now, before we get started, let's sort of somewhat define facial masculinity. Masculine faces are thought to have a different structure of cheekbones and brow ridges than normal faces. They're thought to have a longer face, particularly a more enhanced jaw structure, a bigger jaw structure with a slightly longer mid-face. They're also thought to have a more pronounced eyebrow line, in fact like a ridge, sort of like what you'd see with some relatives of humans that had a more pronounced eyebrow ridge, because you've seen some of these skulls probably. And due to that brow ridge, men have slightly narrower eyes. So that's sort of how we're defining academically facial masculinity. How academics, by the way, study facial masculinity is they modify pictures to enhance these effects of the so-called masculine features. And by the way, I hope nobody gets offended by the terms feminine or masculine here. Obviously, these don't apply to everybody, but what we're saying is sort of that these terms somewhat reflect our testosterone levels in puberty, for example, and they differ between men and women on average, such that some women have these features and some men don't have these features, and it's not a judgment on you. We're just trying to learn more about how men and women think subconsciously. And again, if you do feel offended, just look at my face and realize I have the opposite of all these features. So if you are offended, I'm offended too, and we're in it together. Anyway, let's get started with the subject. First, we want to talk about beards in general, sort of. Where are beards more common? Well, let's look at it historically. Historically, a very interesting 2001 paper that reviewed the frequency of facial hair found that facial hair, and by the way, in this discussion of the video, we're mainly focused on light stubble, heavy stubble, and full beards. Anyway, what the study found was that facial hair was more common when there were less women of marriage age available and when there were more men of marriage age available. Consequently, you may think that men are somehow competing with other men and using the facial hair to scare off other men or something like that, but it could also be something that's attracting women. In fact, there's been a long-standing debate among academics about this exact subject. The competition with men is called intra-sexual competition, and the competition to attract women directly is called intersexual competition. Now, if having facial hair does act as some enhancement to intrasexual competition, it's likely what's called a dishonest signal. And we'll get into some details of why in regard to our androgen levels later. But in specific here, I wanted to mention is that facial hair or beards do not appear to protect people's faces from blows. In fact, a recent study on UFC fighters seeing the amount of facial hair and the length of their beards could not find any association between the beard length and the success of the fighters in their bouts. Facial hair and beards in particular are also more common in cities, in urban environments where there's more anonymity and there's more intrasexual competition. In fact, beards are at the highest frequency in densely populated urban centers of countries whose women do like beards. And with regard to the international diversity in how women regard beards, women tend to like beards the most in countries with low socioeconomic stability, and particularly where economic resources are somewhat scarce, which makes me think that this may be due to women having to depend more on their husbands there, and the beard being an indicator somehow of reliability. Next, how are beards associated with your masculinity? How does having a beard affect your masculinity? Well, if you don't have a very masculine face, you'll notice, even if you do, that having a longer beard enhances particularly the features that define masculinity in the face. Specifically, it enhances the lower jaw, increasing the length of the face and increasing particularly the lower jaw size. This changes what's called the face width to height ratio, which we'll talk about a lot in future videos. Beards do this so well that men with smaller jaws and smaller lower faces that have longer beards appear more masculine than men with bigger, squarer jaws. So one effect of beards on masculinity is affecting the shape of a man's face. The other effect is by masking features. So heavy stubble or beards will mask both masculine and feminine features, reducing the extremity of having either of those phenotypes, such that clean-shaven men's facial masculinity affects the judgment of masculinity on them by both men and women more than bearded men, and such that beards in the end are more influential on people's judgment of your masculinity than your actual masculine features, which is really a great outcome for men and a great advantage. Men who are not born with those features can simply grow a longer beard if they want to appear very masculine to both men and women. And by the way, a side note here, if you think you can't grow a very thick full beard, you can. You can just modify this with very quickly I'll mention, if you use 10% or more minoxidil on your face twice a day for 2 years straight, even if you have no beard hair now, you will. And if you also combine that with androgenic signaling, like going on very high testosterone levels at the same time, this will potentiate the effects of the minoxidil. You'll end up with a very thick beard. Trust me, you can. A lot of female to male transgenders who are not even hairy end up with very, very thick beards. You can easily change this irrespective of your ethnicity. Next, how do beards affect your ability to communicate with others? Your communication signals in your face. Interestingly, beards accentuate angry expressions in the face while they reduce the expressions that are happy. So they potentiate signals from us of anger and hostility while they reduce signals of us that may be seen as friendly or docile. In fact, supporting this, men who have beards in questionnaires tend to prefer other men not to have beards, which seems to indicate that it's some kind of, either it's something special about them or there is some kind of subconscious dominance effect. Interestingly, beards may also affect how women and men consider you trustworthy or able. We'll get more into this in regards to romantic relationships later, but there's an interesting 2021 study that showed that men, salesmen in particular, with beards were considered to be having higher expertise and more trustworthy. And that really surprised me. I don't know if this would hold for all ethnicities. In my case, for example, if I have a longer beard, I get treated with suspicion and hostility, which may make sense. So this might not hold for everybody. Next, we'll take a break from beards for a second to talk about how facial masculinity is associated with women's attraction to men. In particular, and this really surprised me, women seem to prefer not the most extreme masculinization of faces, nor the most feminine. But surprisingly, they prefer more masculine faces for long-term relationships, but slightly more feminine faces for short-term relationships. I assume this has to do with something regarding an objective value of beauty. Probably the men who are slightly more feminine here are actually slightly more beautiful, and this is a proxy for beauty, and maybe more masculine features are objectively regarded as less beautiful. Those are just my thoughts though, not from the papers, and there's no evidence for that. Also, I should mention something. Facial masculinity is thought to, or was thought to, reflect more pubertal and childhood testosterone levels or androgenic signaling, whereas the beards are thought to traditionally reflect adult testosterone levels. Consequently, academics originally theorized that beards were honest signals to women of an adult man's testosterone levels or androgenic signaling, and therefore a signal about how well he could potentially protect them and provide for their family. But this turned out not to be true. Recent studies have shown that there are no association between either personality traits reflecting dominance and masculinity or testosterone levels among beard lengths in Europe. I feel like this study may have missed the point a little bit though, because the beards right now in Europe may be more of a signal of a person's fashion sense and trendiness, whereas I think the thickness of stubble or hair on the beard may be an honest indicator of current androgenic signaling. In fact, I know it is, because the thickness of my beard would change when I used to use steroids. It was much thicker than it is right now, actually. These areas were much thicker, and they would keep getting thicker the longer I had testosterone levels that high. Whereas when I stayed off these testosterone for 2 years or so, my beard lessened and got a bit lighter. So it's certainly true within a person. I don't know if it's true across people, but I think the problem with the study was they were not considering the density of the beard. Actually, there's another point I want to mention. There's not just the density of the beard, but the thickness and lengths of the full hairs. These may be indicative, for example, of health of the person. Also, they're affected by genes, I've noticed. I want to mention this in another video. It's one of those odd observations I've made. But anyway, next, let's talk about the real subject matter, which is women's attraction and preferences for facial hair and beards. First, for short-term attractiveness, that is, you could think of a woman's interest in having sex with a man or having a short-term fling with him, where she doesn't have to worry about his personality or usefulness in the long term. Women tend to prefer stubble, short or long stubble. They prefer either of them, but they dislike compared to that full beards or clean shaven faces. Remember, this is on average. You're going to meet many women who prefer clean shaven faces, which may be due to her upbringing. In fact, I'm going to quote a study that reports that Czech women tend to prefer men who have beard lengths that are similar to their father's beard length when they were growing up. And that's an intuitive result. So you're going to meet women who like clean shaven faces, and you're going to meet women who have some obsession with beards. Everyone varies. You'll encounter a lot of different people. We're talking about averages here. We're talking about, on average, women tend to prefer stubble to both thick beards, long beards, and shaved faces. In fact, not only do women have different preferences, but it also depends on how other men look. So for example, clean shaven faces are more preferred when they're more rare, and long beards are also more preferred when they're more rare, indicating what's called a negative frequency dependent relationship. Which makes sense, right? That's very intuitive. It's likely due to the salience of having a long beard or being clean shaven when nobody else is. You stand out. It's sort of like the idea of peacocking for pickup artists. When somebody wears something very unusual to go to a club, not because it looks good, but because it's going to make him be noticed more and also indicate confidence. That's another thing. Also, something else that makes sense. Feminine faces in men are the ones who experience the greatest boost in attractiveness rating for short-term attractiveness when they have stubble, whereas masculine faces are less helped in their attractiveness when they develop stubble. This again makes sense, and I would go a little bit further to assume on my own, but this may be useful for you guys, that if your beard is less diffuse, meaning there's some kind of line here and here, it may even further accentuate the attractiveness of your face to women if you have a feminine face or a smaller lower jaw, because it seems to basically do that. It has some masculine effect, but it also shapes the face. Now, as we saw with facial masculinity, where women cared more about the masculinity of a man's face when they were thinking about him in regards to a long-term relationship, the same is sort of true with beards, and seems to indicate to us another evidence that beards sort of communicate masculinity to women. In particular, women with children much prefer bearded men as compared to women without children or pregnant women. And pregnant women prefer beards more the closer they get to the birth of their child. And finally, before we summarize, for those that are curious, it seems to be the case that homosexual men have a slightly greater preference for facial hair than women do, which seems to be in line with previous assumptions that homosexual men may care a little bit more about masculinity than women do. So what are the takeaways from all of this? Well, first of all, beards are communicative, but they're dishonest signals actually. They're dishonest about men's testosterone levels, at least the length of the beard is. Although I disagree, I think that the density, which is what they should have studied, would have indicated that they're honest signals. But nonetheless, long beards are not honest signals of a man's testosterone level. They don't really indicate that he has a more masculine or dominant personality either. Second, beards are also dishonest signals to other men about intrasexual competition. They're not protective for men's ability to withstand blows in competitions. Beards communicate masculinity to both genders, whether they're attracted to you or not. They communicate responsibility or dependability. Beards also alter your ability to communicate with facial expressions. Specifically, they potentiate or increase your angry expressions and reduce or attenuate your happy expressions. And finally, specifically to women, beards communicate your value as a husband or father, indicating your dependability, trustworthiness, ability to protect them, and so on. Next, what we learned about attractiveness is that surprisingly, women are not the most attracted to the most masculine facial features, and they're also not very attracted to the most feminine facial features. For all men, light or heavier stubble will make their face appear the most attractive. But the ideal face for women seems to be a slightly feminine face that has stubble. Not only that, but men with slightly feminine faces experience the most increase in their attractiveness to women when they develop stubble going from clean shaven. So what are the practical takeaways from these 2 decades of academic research into facial hair? Well, first of all, you may want to grow a beard if you have an unusually small lower face like I do. Or you may want to also grow a beard if you've been ever called a pushover or consider that people don't take you as being a dominant or masculine person and you want to be. Also, you may want to grow a longer beard if you're specifically trying to attract a woman to get married and have children. On the other hand, you may want to shave your face completely if you've ever been called hostile or if the term toxic masculinity has ever been used around you. Finally, you would likely want to have either short or longer stubble if your main goal is to be the most attractive as possible. Anyway, friends, I hope you found this interesting. I look forward to seeing you this afternoon.